As mentioned, I'm Trevor. I'm going to be here to tell you a little bit about Patchtest, Devtool, and beyond, workflows in Scarthgap, specifically for developers. A little bit about the agenda today. Sorry, I'm used to holding the mic in the right place. I'm going to give a brief intro about Baylibra and myself. I'm going to talk about the Yocto RFQ and some context for it. And then I'm going to jump into some examples and some details about project tooling and Patchtest. The work contained here covers quite a few areas, so I won't be able to cover everything in a lot of detail, but I'll give some examples in some key areas that I think are really cool personally and will benefit the project quite a bit. And then once I'm through project tooling and Patchtest, I'm going to go into a brief summary and talk again a little bit about what comes next. So a little bit about Baylibra. So we're a services company specializing in embedded. There's a list of examples there on the kind of things that we're fond of doing. As of 2024, we actually have a compilers team as well. We're based in Nice, that's where the main office is, but we're all over the place, Canada, the US, Taiwan, a few other places. We're a Linux Foundation member. There's lots of Yocto contributors and maintainers on the team. If you want to find out more about the company, you can go to the baylibra.com website. A little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. So I'm an embedded Linux developer, Python expert to some degree. I'm based in the Ottawa, Canada area. Started using Linux in 2010. I've been using Yocto since about 2019 when I joined Wind River. I'm a maintainer right now for Patchtest, a variety of Python recipes and putting in different miscellaneous contributions in OE core and other layers here and there. I joined Baylibra last April. So yeah, this talk is about developer workflows in Scarthgap. So as anyone who spends any time on Yocto knows, there's lots of different tools that we all like to use. A lot of them are actually carried and maintained by the project itself. And again, this talk is really about what's in store for them in Scarthgap and what we can expect in the next few years. And there's a picture of the release's namesake right there. So a little bit of context. There's a talk on YouTube from last year from Philip, the Yocto Project, where we're going and what's next. Probably the best place to get context on the work that was done last fall. This covers all the key areas that were focused on by the RFQ. More recently, Richard put together a blog post on the Yocto Project website that talks about the outcomes of that as well as the remaining challenges. So those are both good resources to check out for more details. But the summary is that, there was an RFQ for a bunch of areas in Yocto last fall, funded by the Sovereign Tech Fund, and Baylibra worked on project tooling and Patchtest out of those areas. So I'll jump into talking about project tooling. Can everyone hear me okay? So this part of the work was actually led by my colleagues Pidge and Julien Stefan. There were 4 focus areas there, so Devtool and recipetool, which are kind of intertwined. Recipetool actually predates Devtool, as I was told recently, but now it's mainly called from within Devtool. There's also sudo, and then some UI testing proof of concepts that were folded into that work as well. And here's a little bit more detail about the specifics of that. So there were a variety of bugs listed on the Yocto bug triage for Devtool, recipetool, sudo, miscellaneous user group bugs, and again, the UI testing. So if you're interested to see that kind of work or what was the impetus for all this, you can go look up the specific numbers. A little bit about Devtool as it was before the RFQ work was done. So this is Tim Warling's talk from 2017. So 7 years old now, but it's still quite relevant for learning the basics of Devtool. That being said, if you look at the details of what it supports or what it supported at the time, what stands out to me is the Yocto, or sorry, Yocto, the Python support, setup tools and distutils, which is a little bit dated at this point. Just a little bit. So, to that point, you look at that as a contemporary Python developer and you start wondering what year you're in. So hopefully this is visible. So I'm going to do a little bit of a before and after with Devtool here. These are screenshots. In this case, I checked out the Kirkston branch and then did a Devtool add with the tarball URL for pilot on the PyP website. And this is what it output and put it as a recipe file. So you can see the basics of what you'd expect for a recipe there. There's a little bit about the license, the source URI, but really, when you look at this recipe, you might as well just go and copy another Python recipe and modify it yourself. There's not really much useful here. And in fact, this doesn't work at all out of the box. You can't compile this successfully. You'll get some sort of build error right before the image is finalized. And I actually went and tried that, and it did blow up in that manner. For comparison afterwards, I'll let a quote from IRC with a conversation with Tim speak for itself. The work that was done was very much appreciated, makes managing Python modules way easier than it used to be. Just for comparison, hopefully this is readable again. So this is with the Scarthgap branch checked out, and you can see the devtool add command that I've got listed at the top actually targets the PyP page for the module, not the actual tarball. On the left is the recipe file, and on the right is an image that I booted and loaded the Python interpreter and tried to import the pilot module that is generated from that recipe. And it actually worked out of the box, which was really cool. Is one of the main tests we like to do when a new Python module comes along or a new version is added is, build it into an image, make sure that it pulls in the interpreter, all the dependencies, and that it will import without any errors, and it did all that. So that was really impressive. A couple of the other areas that we covered for project tooling. So there was a UI testing proof of concept. So for core image Sado or other basic graphical environments, what we wanted to do was be able to compare it against a reference PNG. So once the QEMU instance is up, you want to be able to take a screenshot and make sure that the environment is similar to what you're expecting with that reference. One of the challenges that we had was, asking the question, when is everything rendered for that? And it turns out it depends a lot on the architecture you're booting. So x86, the ARM ones, et cetera, were pretty good. MIPS, not so much. There were lots of icon issues as well. So things like time of day, you couldn't reliably generate without some other workarounds. So you just mask that and the PNG and ignore it in the actual rendered environment. But the work that was done here, and I do have an example on the next slide. What was done has allowed us to start finding some bugs that have been in the system for 10 years or more in some cases. But the caveat there is that a few of the architectures have to be skipped, either because they don't support Sado or because there are actually issues with the images that we pull from them. So here's another quick comparison. QEMU x86-64, that's the familiar environment you expect. On the right, QEMU MIPS, just an intermediate screenshot of the render, not very comparable. Probably not going to show up the same way every time. That's the kind of stuff Pidge was running into, and that is actually something she generated for me last week. Couple more details about the random components here. So sudo was listed, and a lot of the bugs were something we were going to tackle for project tooling. But what it turned out that most of the problems that we identified as sudo didn't actually come from sudo in the end. The things with native SDK intercepts, like ownerships not being set correctly, problems with that in state-dir, that it turned out all that anyone ever really needed to do was just read the man page for makedir and then see exactly how everything gets set up when makedir is called. And there were some messy dependencies with user add, group add. In a lot of cases, some recipes would be trying to add a user that was a member of a group before that group actually existed. So you run into all sorts of issues building in cases like that. So when it comes to project tooling, what could be coming next? Better UI testing. So there's kind of an open call right now. Like if anybody's interested in submitting patches, I'm sure they'd be much appreciated there. Sudo doesn't currently have a maintainer unless someone signed up in the last few hours. I haven't checked. There's still plenty of bugs. If anybody's looked at the auto builder intermittent list, that's really a nightmare to challenge. But in general, there's a lot of them out there right now that are very old, very difficult to reproduce. Some complicated Devtool cases still need help. So when you have a recipe that supports submodules and is calling in nested sources, those might not all build well after you use Devtool on them. And the Rust plugin for Devtool still needs some work as well. I'm going to talk a bit about Patchtest now, my personal favorite. So Yocto uses mailing lists for contributions and discussion. The volume's high, but we really don't want the Richard Purdy's of the world and the Kem Rajas and whatnot spending their time telling people that they've forgotten to specify why a license checksum was changed or that sort of thing. So we want some sort of automated service for that. And in the past, and again, currently, the solution for that has been Patchtest. So this is what I believe to be the very last email that was ever submitted by the old Patchtest service on the mailing list. So you can see a little bit about the structure of the email, what kind of warnings it would send to the user in the mailing list. You can also see the date over there. It's actually about 3.5 years since that was sent. So in that time, that automated system wasn't there to help the maintainers out. You can also see an example at the bottom of the kind of thing it'll test for. In this case, the short log was just a little bit too long. So what broke? Patchwork, a while ago, there was a fork. And in that, as a consequence of that fork, one of the features that used to be there, but that was no longer supported, was what was called poll events. So you could go and you could check to see if there was a new revision to a series or if something had been archived or something like that. That wasn't there anymore, but all of the patchwork scripts under the hood, somewhere in the chain, well, this was in pretty much every chain that ran there. So all of a sudden Patchtest was not going to work because there was nothing to pull. So that was the big one, but there were also a lot of really outdated recipes in the meta Patchtest layer. The kernel BB append, when I looked at it, I think was still supporting like a 4.x kernel or something like that. So a lot of minor upgrades to handle as well. And as I mentioned, there's a bunch of scripts that were in that chain that did certain things like pull down the latest patches or check to see if anything failed that weren't going to work either for one reason or another. So before, Patchtest was essentially a collection of single-purpose scripts that were built into a QEMU image called core image Patchtest, and then that would pull down the latest patches, test them, and then report that to the mailing list and the submitters. As I mentioned, it relies on the old Patchwork tool called getpw, which is just a Python module for interacting with Patchwork, and a bunch of parsing modules for mboxes and text in general. It was split across 2 different repos, in addition to needing the core ones. Meta Patchtest was where the bulk of everything recipe-wise resided, and then Patchtest OE, which was just the test suite, which is a little bit odd. And as I had mentioned on the previous slide, there were a bunch of different tools set up to support both the host and guest mode. Basically, whether you're trying to just test patches locally or you actually want to build the core image Patchtest image and test them in isolation, which weren't working. So afterwards, so last fall, Patchtest and the test suite were merged into OE Core. Meta Patchtest is only host to the things we need to build core image Patchtest and nothing else. Patchtest is much, in my opinion, I'm maybe a little bit biased, much more usable by contributors to test their patches before they submit them. And it's also the service, the automated service is deployed on the Yocto Project infrastructure, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And there are some docs, simple ones, just available in scripts, the same place you can find the actual tool. And it's been doing a great job over the last few months catching things on the mailing list, regardless of who's submitting them. Just to give you a really good example, here's me submitting an uprev to RPM in late February, and it caught me. The reason being that I had submitted the upgrade, there was a carried patch that was no longer relevant. I think it was now in that version. So I had taken it out of the actual recipe file, but forgot to remove it from the Git tree. So I submitted that patch, and then Patchtest about 15 minutes later told me I was wrong. And there you can see Richard talking in the Yocto infrastructure chat, expressing his amusement that my own tool caught me. And there's another one I didn't put on here, but he actually was remarking recently that I think it's caught pretty much every one of the maintainers, Ross and everybody else, several times. Here's a little bit more about Patchtest in action. So I had to cut this off. Again, hopefully this is readable, but this is me running Patchtest against a random patch I pulled down off of Patchwork. You can get an idea for the kinds of tests it runs. Again, there's probably, I think, 17 or 18 more that are cut off here just to make this readable. But it tests all sorts of things, right? It tests to make sure that you're not just taking an auto upgrade helper patch and submitting it, or tries to, without doing any extra testing. There's a merge test that's currently disabled, but that'll be coming soon. It's testing the short log format like we saw a few slides back. Signed off bys, it does that for both the mbox itself and any source patches that are carried. Testing to make sure you have the right mailing list, a bunch of other things too. Infrastructure-wise, so every 15 minutes or so, the Patchtest service checks the Patchwork instance for OE core and tests the patches that it finds. It does this by just tracking the series ID and then pulling down the patches individually. Results are, again, reported on the mailing list and directly to the author. There are guards in place for this, so in addition to the isolation we get from QEMU, there's runtime and line length limits. So if it the Patchtest instance boots up and takes more than 15 minutes to run the tests on those patches, it'll just shut down. And it also is currently using a small CI tool called Laminar to automate this. It's basically a simple front end for cron jobs and running bash scripts, but it's a personal favorite of mine. So beyond for Patchtest, one of the big things, and the first bullet kind of covers all the other ones, is address all the existing issues. So supporting other layers, in particular Meta Open Embedded, might even come back to Meta Python and try that again. Customized test suites. Right now there's just the one for OE core, but there's no reason why we couldn't be using more than one for other cases. Full auto builder integration would be great. Performance improvements is really the big one. So I mentioned a couple of slides back that there's a merge test that's not currently operating. And when that's fixed and we're testing an entire series at once, it should drastically reduce the runtime for Patchtest, just because right now it tests them patch by patch and has to go through every single patch, start bit bake 2 or 3 times to run all the tests. So that'll be a big improvement there. More self-tests. You know, there's 37, I think, right now, but we could easily get it up to 100. Standalone Python module might be coming in the future too. I've looked at this a few different times and thought about what that might look like. But really, Patchtest, I don't think needs BitBake. BitBake already does a lot of testing for recipes that you're adding or modifying. And really what it's doing is just testing text files to make sure you've got all the right format in there, right? And then maybe even some support for some other patch handling tools like P4. So a quick summary of everything that was done in project tooling and Patchtest. So there's always another module that we have to handle. Now they're a lot less work. Just going back to the Python example I showed earlier. Devtool, I didn't show this, but finally supports submodules and nested sources. The auto upgrade helper should run a bit smoother in theory. So if you don't know how that works, it's a similar automated service that periodically checks to make sure, or to see if there are any new versions of recipes. It'll try to run that upgrade with Devtool. If it succeeds, It'll send those patches to the mailing list along with a summary of all the recipes that it tried, the ones that succeed and the ones that failed with different Devtool errors. So those changes should help there. There'll be a smoother experience within S-State in creating users for images. Developers, thanks to Patchtest, can get more feedback before submission, and there's a bit of a safety net there on the mailing list, just in case anything did get by when you submitted stuff. This next one's a bit of an opinion, but I think the fact that all those Patchtest results will be on the mailing list now is a good reference for other people who are just getting into the project, get an idea for things they need to make sure to check. You know, I remember the first few times I tried to contribute to patches on GitHub, for example, I forgot my sign-off buys and that sort of thing. And it, in a way, brings the Yocto mailing list workflow a little bit closer in spirit to what we expect from those web platforms. So this slide is kind of a summary of the previous Beyonds. So there's a lot of bug cleanup that I think could happen in like a next RFQ. More logic could be put into Devtool and recipetool. All the stuff I mentioned before about the Patchtest improvements. But really, it's a question of what the community thinks. I think, you know, there's a lot of things hanging there that, a lot of areas that could use some improvement. So. Special thanks to the Sovereign Tech Fund, obviously. Without them, this work wouldn't have happened, at least not at the pace that it did. Pidge and Julian, the other Julian who's also in the audience right now, my colleague David Lechner, Kevin Hillman, Tim Orling, and Richard Purdy, sorry, tongue-tied, without whose tireless work we would be in dire straits, and the Yocto Project community itself.
Thanks.